Welcome back to Creative Photo Painting in Photoshop. My name is Kirk Nelson. This is lesson number 2. This is a tool overview lesson. So this lesson isn't part of the regular projects of the course. I just want to go over 4 specific features in Photoshop that I want you to be familiar with before we launch into the production of those different projects. So I've got Photoshop open here, and I've also got this cute picture of this kitty cat. This photo comes to us from morguefile.com. The link is available in the course files section, as well as the image itself. You don't really need to open it and follow along. I just want you to see what some of these tools are that I'm going to be referring to in later lessons. First of all, I want to show you where the oil paint filter lives and how to use it. It's very simply in the filter menu, and it's oil paint. This will be used in the first project. Now, there's not a lot to really say about this at this point, other than the fact that we've got a bunch of sliders over here, and we'll go over these more extensively in the oil paint project. It's a pretty good filter. It does still tend to look like a filter, but is one of the quickest and easiest ways to produce a painter-ish like effect from a photograph. The next feature I want to show you is the Smudge Brush. And that is this icon with the little down pointing hand here. If you don't see it, it's because it's hiding behind the blur tool. If you hold down your mouse button on that, you get the fly out tool menu and pick the Smudge Brush. Now the Smudge Brush does have a brush tip associated with it, and you can change that by either right clicking and choosing from one of the pop-ups here, and we'll increase the size of that one. Or you can use it in the options bar up here, where you can do the little fly down and choose the size that way. But that's just regular brush tips. What I want you to see is how this tool actually works. In its default mode, it's set to probably 100% strength, and both the sample all layers and finger painting is turned off, and the mode is set to normal. What this does is it just grabs pixels and starts smudging them and streaking them along. Okay? At full strength, 100%, it's not quite as useful as you think it might be. Put it down to 1% and it barely does anything. So more than likely you're going to be using it at a upper 80s type of percent, and you can see how that starts tapering off the longer you go with it. It's not a full brush type of effect. It does actually grab and sort of smudge things out. Now also, it's helpful not to use the solid round brush. You get a much better effect if you use one of maybe like the chalk or the scatter brushes. You get a much more painterly type of effect that way. And we'll go over exactly how to do this, how to do it effectively in the smudge painting lesson. But I want you to be aware of where this tool is and what it does and then how to use it. If you click the finger painting, what that does is it takes the foreground color, it drops a dab of it, and then starts smearing that in with the background color. Let's use a color that's really easy to see. Perhaps a bright yellow. You can see how it just dabs that in and begins smudging it in with the rest of the painting. That's what the finger painting does. And the higher the strength is, the more that color gets retained in the brush stroke. Okay, if you use the sample all layers, that's good for if you've got a couple of layers and you need to sample the colors from beneath them. Because if this is turned off and you're working on a blank layer, it doesn't really do much. Well, let's turn off the finger painting. You see, it doesn't really grab anything that if there's nothing there for it to grab. But if you turn on the sample all layers, it's going to grab those pixels from underneath. Now, it is rather processor intensive, so you may find the performance of your machine might bog down a little bit. The modes are set to normal, and that's how you're going to use it most of the time. You may use some darken and lighten, and that's just it. If you use the darken, it'll smudge the darker colors over the light. If you use the lighten, it'll insist on going the other way. The next feature I want to review isn't so much a tool as it is a brush tip. In fact, that's exactly that, a brush tip. If you open the brush presets panel, you'll see some of these brushes have what looks like an actual brush instead of a profile view. And that's because these are called the natural media bristle tips. And if we grab one of those, I'll show you how it works. Let's go with the round angle low stiffness. All right, I've got a new layer set up here, and I've got my regular brush tool. Now these brushes are designed to be used with a graphics tablet and a stylus. Now if you look at the preview window over there, I'm rotating my stylus around, I'm adjusting the tilt. Now watch what happens as I begin to sort of paint with it. watch the preview window. It's as if there's actual bristles of this brush that can be splayed out and can be dragged around, and it feels much more like a realistic paintbrush. The performance does lag a little bit because I'm doing full screen video capture, but yours really shouldn't be quite as bad as that was. So these are actually pretty cool to work with, especially if you're used to using natural media brushes. If you open up the brush panel, you'll see there's a lot of different bristle qualities that we can work with in here. Okay, the overall shape has a whole list here. I'm going with the round angle right now because it works well with what I'm doing. There's a bristles density, as in how many bristles you actually want on the brush. Pull that down really few and you get a very lightly bristled brush, and it's a much thicker one the higher you go with that. The length, look at the difference in the preview panel there. So if we pull this really down low, there's a very short, stubby bristle brushes, and that creates a very stout type of brush stroke. Pull it up all the way, and you can twirl those around more. The thickness refers to the actual thickness of each bristle. Stiffness is how much they give way under the pressure as you drag it along. And then the angle is sort of rotates that rounded angle along. So those are all features for the bristle tips. And this really changed the way that we painted in Photoshop. Now these tips can be used on the Smudge Brush, which we just reviewed. They can also be used on the Mixer Brush tool, which is the next thing that we're going to get into. The Mixer Brush tool is hiding underneath the regular brush toolbox. Again, if you hold down the mouse button as you click on that brush tool, it does this little fly out move, and you can pick the mixer brush from that. Now at first glance, it seems to be just another variation of the Smudge Brush, but it's really so much more. There's a lot of different options, and they can be somewhat confusing, so I'm going to try to simplify them as much as I can. The three main ones to be concerned with is over here, the wet, load, and somewhat the mix. It's really the wet and the load that determine how this brush works with the pixels of the image that you're working on. First, let's begin with describing what the wet means. If the wetness is cranked all the way up to 100%, it is not meaning that the paint on the brush is wet. It's meaning the paint on the canvas will appear to be wet, which means things will smudge around significantly, as if you were dragging that brush through wet paint on the canvas. Now, load refers to how much color is already on that brush when you begin dragging it through. Right now we have it set to 5%, that's rather low. So if we put the wet all the way back down to 0, and we put that load up to 100%, and let's load the color over here. That's what this little sample well is. I'm loading the color there. This is the ink color. Now this behaves very much like just a regular brush, because there's no wetness associated with it. Once we undo that, and we increase some wetness, now what we'll get is some mixture between the pixels that's on the canvas and the color that's already loaded onto the brush. And it also changes the color of the brush. Because if that paint was actually wet and you were working with a real brush, some of that wet paint would get on the brush while the paint from the brush gets on the canvas. So they tend to mix together in both places, on the brush and on the canvas. And that's what this paint well is indicating here. And so that will also impact the next strokes that you paint, because it'll already have some of that paint on there, and it'll continue to adjust that color there. Do the drop down here to clean the brush, and then load the brush again, which is like dipping your brush in water and cleaning it up, dipping it back into your paint can to reload it. Or you can use these two icons here. This one is an auto load. So after each stroke, it loads it again. But you'll notice it's still mixing on there. So that's why we add this clean the brush after each stroke. And so it's as if after every time you let up that button or release it from the canvas, it cleans it and strokes it again. That's dealing mostly with, well, part of the loaded color. Let's now pull down with that load a little bit and talk about that mix some. Because the mix really refers to how much the wet canvas paint mixes with the loaded brush paint. So if we pull it up 100%, we're going to get the most amount of mix. Now, there doesn't seem to be a lot of mix there because the load is really low. If we pull the load up fully, we'll get a little bit more mix in that, but the heavy wetness seems to be overcoming it. Now, the mix setting really does get determined by how much wetness is in there. And it's sort of difficult thing to grab hold of. It's like the wetness becomes more like a smudge brush, but the mix is what changes it from smudge to a mixer brush. So it will continue to mix the paint even after the initial wetness has been mixed, if that makes any sense at all. You don't really need to bother too much with these, but I wanted to go ahead and explain those so that you could follow along with what I'm doing. If you do end up using your own custom settings for this, deal with some of the presets, because you'll find these are really pretty comprehensive for what you're going to need it for. So I would encourage you to go ahead and start playing with some of these. If you want to use it as more of a mixture type thing, just clean the brush and keep it clean. Don't keep loaded color in there. You'll get a much better, more mixture type of smudge effect that's a little bit more sophisticated than just the smudge tool. All right, guys, that's it for lesson number 2. That's an overview of some of the features that we're going to be using during these projects of this course. In fact, the next lesson, lesson number 3, will launch out on the oil paint filter project with the quickest and easiest way to do a painterly looking portrait in Photoshop.